Hey again. Please comment down below what time it is wherever you are. Today, I'm going to tell you a real story of a 17-year-old girl named Emma Peterson. The kind of girl everyone knew, everyone loved, and no one expected to vanish. She lived in a quiet suburb where front doors were left unlocked, and danger felt like a distant rumor. But one morning, Emma didn't come home. By nightfall, her car was found abandoned near the woods. And by the next day, the entire neighborhood was asking the same terrifying question: how could someone so good meet such a brutal end, and how did no one see it coming? It started as a routine morning, the kind that didn't stand out in any way. A retired man, who had lived in the neighborhood for more than 2 decades, decided to take his usual walk along the wooded trail that bordered the suburb. He carried his coffee in a travel mug and gave a friendly wave to the few neighbors who were out early working in their yards. The trail was quiet, the light filtering through the trees in scattered patches. It was supposed to be peaceful. Instead, it became the moment everything changed. Just a few yards off the path, something caught his eye, something white against the brown and green of the forest floor. It took a second for his mind to register what it was. At first glance, it looked like a discarded piece of clothing. The trail had never been the site of much litter, so he figured it was unusual, but pretty harmless. But as he took a few more steps, curiosity got the better of him, and he stepped carefully through the grass to get a closer look. That curiosity turned to horror. The white fabric was part of a bloodied shirt, and under it lay a motionless body. To describe the man's reaction as panic would be an understatement. His hands shook as he fumbled for his phone. He didn't move closer. Something about the way the victim was lying made it terribly clear there was nothing he could do. After dialing 911, he spent the longest 5 minutes of his life, waiting for sirens to cut through the stillness of the morning. Every second, he kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting someone or something to come out of the woods. Police cars arrived quickly, speeding down the narrow neighborhood road that led to the trail. Officers emerged cautiously, scanning the area before approaching the scene. The site was taped off almost immediately, yellow caution tape stretching between trees, creating an oddly surreal barrier between ordinary life and a nightmare. More and more police arrived as word spread, followed by a forensic team that unpacked equipment with grim efficiency. Neighbors who had been walking dogs or returning from their morning jogs began to gather, whispering nervously as they watched. Questions buzzed through the crowd. Who was the victim? How did this happen? And most terrifying of all, was the killer still nearby? In neighborhoods like this one, small and quiet, where the biggest concerns were noisy lawnmowers or the occasional neighborhood meeting, such discoveries are almost unheard of. According to a recent analysis by the US Bureau of Justice, areas like this report violent crimes at less than half the rate of urban settings. Murders, specifically, are so uncommon that many suburban police departments are unequipped for full-scale homicide investigations. The local officers referred to this as their first such case in years, which accounted for the caution and almost shaky tension in their early response. The victim's body gave away few obvious clues at first glance, at least not to the public. Nearby, crime scene analysts examined items strewn across the ground. A single broken necklace, its chain glittering faintly in the sunlight, caught their attention. A notebook partly covered in mud was carefully bagged for inspection, in case it might hold fingerprints or other evidence. And there, hanging just faintly on the nearby shrubs, were strands of long, dark hair, torn loose. For the people surrounding the scene, the wait for an identity became excruciating. The wooded trail, usually a place where residents felt safe letting their children ride bikes or walk their dogs, was now a symbol of something far darker. Neighbors couldn't help looking at one another with a sliver of suspicion. Police told reporters they believed the victim had not been there long, likely no more than a day, based on the minimal decomposition of the body and lack of animal interference. That detail brought some comfort. At least it suggested the crime had not gone unnoticed for long, but it also made the thought of the murderer's presence terrifyingly recent. Later that evening, police confirmed an identification, and it was a name no one wanted to hear. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't someone passing through the town and being in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was someone they all knew, Emma Peterson, the girl next door. Emma had grown up on this street. Her family had lived there for years, throwing barbecues in their yard every summer and lending out gardening tools to anyone who needed them. Just the evening before, Emma's younger brother had passed around missing persons flyers to a handful of neighbors after she hadn't come home the previous night. Everyone assumed she would turn back up soon. Emma wasn't the type to disappear willingly. She always told someone where she was going. But now, seeing the police tape and hearing her name spoken with a heaviness that left no room for hope, the idea that she was gone hit with the force of a battering ram. Neighbors described Emma as kind and cheerful, quick to bake cookies for new residents or pet sit when her neighbors went on vacation. She was finishing her senior year of high school and had been busy touring colleges, excited about the next chapter of her life. She was every parent's dream of a daughter, one resident told reporters, her voice catching. Emma's parents had yet to make a formal statement, but everyone knew this was a loss so profound that words wouldn't do it justice. As night fell, the flashing red and blue lights near the trail lit up the faces of wide-eyed onlookers who didn't seem able to walk away. Some brought candles, arranging them in a makeshift memorial at the park entrance. A few left handwritten notes recognizing Emma's kindness and warmth, as though the words might somehow reach her. And through their grief, much of the community's focus sharpened toward the one thing they didn't have: answers. What had led to this tragedy? And who could have done something so violent to someone so kind? The questions hung heavily in the air, unanswered. The details of the next few hours began trickling out quietly. While neighbors speculated, investigators were busy combing through the trail and surrounding area. Police dogs had been called in to detect the scent of anyone who might have lingered. Officers went door to door asking residents if they had seen anything unusual: a strange car parked on the street, an argument someone might have overheard. Most told them no. Those who tried to think back to the previous night found their memories unhelpful, and fragments of details recalled too late. Their disappointment in themselves was almost palpable. The crime scene specialists worked late into the night, photographing the area and even extending their perimeter to the nearby residential street. Suspicion began to build among those examining the evidence. Police had yet to release an official statement about cause of death, but rumors flew fast. Some believed Emma hadn't known the person responsible. Others whispered about the possibility of a robbery turned violent, though her wallet and jewelry hadn't been touched. The necklace chain found broken nearby began to draw attention. Whispers about the tug that must have pulled it from her neck made people's stomachs twist. Even as the lens began to narrow, some neighbors recalled seeing a car late at night, headlights cutting briefly across their windows. It became clear this was no random act of nature. The look exchanged between officers said what few locals were willing to put into words. Someone in their town had blood on their hands. It was just a matter of figuring out who. But for now, no one had answers. The next step was to piece together Emma's life, not just what made her so loved, but also any potential aspects that might have made her tragically vulnerable. If someone were to see beyond her cheerfulness and trust, what might they have known that the rest of the town had completely missed? For her family and for the investigators swarming the scene, one thing was clear. Emma wasn't just another face in a sea of high schoolers about to graduate. To everyone here, she was Emma, the girl everyone knew, the girl who would now forever be remembered for the life she didn't get to live. Emma Peterson was the kind of person who left an impression without even trying. She was thoughtful in a quiet way, a girl who made you feel like details about your life mattered. At just 17 years old, she had already become something of a fixture in the neighborhood. Whether she was playing with kids on the block, helping her mom in the garden, or driving her younger brother to school, Emma made an impact on everyone she encountered. Her face was one people remembered, a soft, inviting smile framed by dark brown hair that she usually wore in a loose braid. When people spoke about her after the discovery, their words painted a picture of someone who seemed untouchable. Sweet, humble, grounded, Emma was the last person anyone imagined could ever end up the victim of a violent crime. Emma's family described her as their shining star. Her parents, Susan and Michael, had always been proud of her determination and work ethic. Despite balancing school, a part-time job at a local cafe, and volunteer shifts at an animal rescue center, Emma never appeared stressed. Her mother often joked that she was the household's organizer-in-chief because of her knack for keeping track of birthdays, appointments, and even meal plans. With graduation just a few months away, Emma had been looking forward to a summer trip before starting college. She had been accepted to 2 state universities and was leaning toward a psychology degree. She always wanted to understand people and help them, her mother shared in a brief statement to local reporters. That's who she was. She lit up the room, but she also had a way of making you feel seen. Life at home was stable, even happy, something not every teenager could claim. Emma's parents worked hard to ensure their kids grew up with a sense of safety and ambition. Michael owned a small landscaping business, and Susan split her time between a part-time accounting job and keeping the family's day-to-day life running smoothly. Emma had a good relationship with her siblings, particularly her younger brother, Logan, who was just 14 years old. "She looked out for me, even when I didn't want her to," Logan said, his voice barely above a whisper, during a community vigil held for Emma. The family was known to host backyard cookouts, where Emma would hand out homemade lemonade or play her guitar for guests. It wasn't the kind of household where anyone expected a tragedy to unfold. Her friends, too, couldn't stop singing her praises. Emma had a tight-knit circle of classmates she had known since elementary school. They described her as thoughtful and funny, always willing to drop everything to help a friend in need. One friend recalled how Emma once stayed up all night tutoring her for a math exam she was sure she would fail. That was just Emma. She would do anything for you without expecting anything in return. Others shared memories of her love for hiking on weekends or hosting movie nights with carefully themed snacks. One friend mentioned Emma's habit of jotting down motivational quotes she found in books or online and sticking them in random places, inside lockers, on notebooks, even in coffee shop tip jars. She always wanted people to feel good about themselves, the friend said with a tearful smile. But there was more to Emma's life than her kindness. Her schedule hinted at her ambition. In addition to her classes and job, Emma had recently started babysitting for a new family that had moved onto the block. She spent 2 evenings a week looking after their toddler, an arrangement that neighbors said she enjoyed despite her already busy life. And yet, those same routines, so ordinary and so seemingly safe, would later become pieces of a chilling puzzle. Police noted how structured Emma's daily life was, an observation that would help them later retrace her final hours. Still, at the time, that structure painted a picture of a girl whose life was firmly on track. There were no obvious signs of trouble, not on the surface. Of course, appearances in cases like Emma's can be deceptive. Studies on homicide victims, particularly young women, have shown how acts of violence often target the very traits that make someone beloved or noticeable. According to an analysis by the Criminal Victimization Center, women between the ages of 16 and 24 are disproportionately targeted because of their perceived accessibility. Perpetrators often exploit openness or routines, finding opportunities in moments where victims feel the safest. For someone like Emma, who embodied that openness and predictability, it is devastatingly clear how her trusting nature might have worked against her when it mattered most. She moved through the world believing in its goodness, never considering that someone could take advantage of her kindness or schedule. What stands out most is the gap between the life she cultivated and the tragedy that ultimately unfolded. Neighbors remarked on how Emma seemed to have a life most parents would want for their children. She didn't skip curfew like some teenagers. She wasn't known for drama or bad decisions. In fact, teachers had even described Emma as a role model for younger students, someone they hoped others would emulate. That image made her killing, or in the hours before the police confirmed it was indeed murder, all the more unfathomable. How could a girl who seemed to embody the neighborhood's ideals of kindness and community have met with such senseless violence? It wasn't until police started to examine Emma's relationships more closely that they began to pick up on subtle threads that might have been warning signs. To her close friends and family, everything in Emma's life seemed orderly, but was it possible she had crossed paths with someone who had other intentions? Investigators began asking pointed questions about anyone Emma had spent time with in the weeks leading up to her death. Her boss at the cafe told police Emma had excellent rapport with regular customers, but had recently mentioned an interaction that left her uncomfortable. Out of politeness, as was her nature, she hadn't pressed the subject. Co-workers said they had thought nothing of it at the time, but now they were beginning to wonder. Could it have been someone she served every week? Someone who mistook her friendly demeanor for an invitation? Her babysitting job also drew scrutiny. Neighbors who saw Emma walking down the street to that house, smiling as she carried craft supplies in a tote bag, now looked back on those moments differently. Was it possible that someone had watched those routines, memorized them, and planned an attack? Emma had never expressed any worries about her job or her interactions with the family she worked for, but that didn't stop investigators from probing. Who, if anyone, might have been paying too much attention to Emma's movements? Her openness, her kindness, all the qualities that endeared her to the people who loved her, may have made her vulnerable in ways no one could have anticipated. Unlike someone more guarded, Emma moved through the world willing to give everyone the benefit of the doubt. But, as investigators would soon discover, that trust might have been misplaced in someone terrifyingly close to home. From the outside, Emma Peterson's life was one to admire. She was smart, kind, determined, a person with every reason to believe the world could be good to her. But, like cracks beneath the surface of a polished vase, the darker truths of her last days were about to come to light. As police started to dig into her relationships and routines, they found inconsistencies that painted a far less idyllic picture. Emma's story was no longer just about who she was. It was about the choices and circumstances that brought her into the path of someone who did the unthinkable. To understand what happened, investigators started to focus on Emma's last hours. Hidden among the monotony of her typical day, there lay the first signs of the tragedy no one had seen coming. Emma's morning started the way it always did. She woke up around 7:00 a.m., the sunlight streaming through her bedroom window. Her mum, Susan, called up the stairs to remind Emma there was a stack of laundry to fold before she left for work. Emma called back, 5 minutes. Her usual reply, whenever she needed to buy a little more time. By the time she joined her family downstairs, she was dressed in her cafe uniform, dark jeans, a plain black shirt, and the white sneakers she bought just a week before. Her typical breakfast was toast and a glass of orange juice, which she ate quickly while scrolling through her phone. She shared a few words with her mom about the weekend plans ahead. There was a school fundraiser Emma had signed up to volunteer for, and she wanted to stop by her grandparents' house too. But for all the plans she made that morning, she would never get the chance to follow through. Susan noticed something out of the ordinary as Emma was getting ready to head out. She seemed a little distracted. She checked her phone several times while tying her shoes and had a slightly furrowed brow, like she was trying to solve a puzzle only she could see. When Susan asked if something was wrong, Emma just shook her head and smiled. "I'm fine, Mom," she said lightly. "I'll see you after work." Emma left the house on time, as she always did, and was last seen just a few minutes later, getting into her car and pulling out of the driveway. Security cameras from a neighboring house confirmed her usual departure and didn't pick up anything unusual. Her car, a silver sedan, was captured making its way toward the highway. The morning shift at the cafe was busy from the start. Her manager later recalled that Emma appeared normal, smiling as she served customers and chatting with co-workers during lulls. Yet one co-worker noticed a subtle change. Emma stepped outside briefly during her break and spent more time than usual on her phone. When asked about it, she shrugged and said, "Just sorting something out," leaving it at that. At the time, it didn't raise any eyebrows. Emma was reliable, the kind of employee who always came back from breaks on time and carried her share of the workload without complaint. No one could have guessed that her brief detours in behavior might have been early signs of trouble. After her shift ended at 2:00 p.m., Emma was expected to head straight home. She usually used the time between work and dinner to start her homework or visit her favorite walking trail nearby. On this particular day, though, she never made it home. Her family became concerned when 4:00 p.m. came and went with no sign of Emma. What made this especially odd was that Emma hadn't told anyone she had other plans, nor had she mentioned running errands after work. By dinner, her mum's worry had turned into outright dread. Several calls to Emma's phone went straight to voicemail, and repeated text messages remained unread. "Where are you?" Susan sent once, then again, her anxiety doubling with each unanswered attempt. Her dad, Michael, drove to Emma's workplace to check if maybe she had stayed late, but the parking lot was empty, and her co-workers confirmed she had left hours earlier. By this point, Logan, Emma's younger brother, had begun calling some of her close friends. No one had seen her. None of them even knew she had gone anywhere besides her usual routine. The hours dragged on. By 9:00 p.m., the family made the decision to call the police and report Emma missing. The responding officers initially handled the situation with caution. Although no one doubted the family's distress, it wasn't uncommon for teenagers to lose track of time. One officer suggested Emma might have spent the afternoon with a friend or gone somewhere to cool off after an argument. Susan immediately rejected that theory. "Emma tells us everything," she insisted firmly. "If she was going anywhere, we would know." Still, the police had protocols to follow. Although the first 24 hours are widely recognized as the most critical in any missing person case, protocol often separates runaways from cases that seem to involve immediate danger. An analysis conducted by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children underscores just how important those early hours are. In over 90% of cases where a child or teenager is abducted and later killed, the murder occurs within the first few hours of disappearance. The time lost waiting to escalate cases from routine missing person to critical alert can have devastating consequences. Emma's family, unwilling to stand by, mobilized their own efforts. Logan printed flyers with her most recent photo and information about her car, while neighbors went door to door asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual. One neighbor noted they had seen Emma's car driving toward the trail that afternoon but dismissed it as normal. When questioned further, they remembered catching sight of another vehicle, an older grey pickup truck, that stopped for a few moments on the same road before continuing on. The detail wasn't much, but it added a layer of tension. By midnight, Emma was no closer to being found. Police had issued a "be on the lookout" alert for her car but hadn't received any leads. Back at home, her parents waited by their phones, jumping at each vibration, praying for an update. In the back of their minds, a question loomed larger than any other. What could have happened to their daughter in broad daylight? The first breakthrough came the next morning when an officer patrolling the trail's parking area located Emma's car. It was locked, the windows rolled up as though it had been parked on purpose, not abandoned out of panic. Inside the vehicle, police found Emma's purse, coat, and phone, everything she might have needed to contact someone for help. The scene opened up more questions than it answered. If Emma wasn't with her car, where was she? And why had she stopped there at all? The discovery of her car became the spark that turned worry into full-blown alarm. Police began combing the surrounding area for signs of Emma. Officers walked side by side along wooded paths, calling her name and stopping to examine anything out of place. Search dogs, trained to track human scents, were brought in, their handlers navigating the thick underbrush of the forest near the trail. The search yielded scattered pieces of jewelry near the car, a pair of earrings, and a single charm that matched a bracelet Emma often wore. By all appearances, they had been dropped deliberately. Forensic specialists were called to the scene and began processing Emma's vehicle as potential evidence. Swipe tests confirmed a faint trace of fingerprint residue on the driver's side door, though it would take days to identify who the prints belonged to. Meanwhile, residents of the neighborhood were gripped by growing unease. For most, the realization was sinking in. Someone might have been watching Emma closely enough to act without anyone noticing. But the most chilling detail about Emma's disappearance was how quickly it seemed to have happened. Based on her car's location and the scattered clues, investigators estimated that Emma's abduction had occurred in less than a 10-minute window, long enough for someone to stop her routine cold, but too short for anyone nearby to intervene. This bloody efficiency only deepened the mystery. Whoever targeted Emma had to know when and how to strike without drawing attention. As investigators expanded their search, they couldn't shake the nagging feeling that some key element of her last day was still missing. What phone call or errand might have pulled her off her usual route and into the trail's isolated parking lot? And was there something or someone in her life she had chosen not to mention? These questions formed the foundation of an investigation that was just beginning. Meanwhile, reports of Emma's disappearance began to dominate conversations across the neighborhood. From worried whispers to active searches, it seemed every resident was suffering beneath the same weight. A growing sense that this wasn't just a terrible accident. Something more sinister was at play, and the entire community was about to come face to face with it. The disappearance of Emma Peterson struck the heart of a community that prided itself on being safe. People moved to this neighborhood to get away from crime, to live somewhere where they could let their kids ride bikes until sunset without worry, or leave their front doors unlocked while running errands. So when the news spread that Emma's car had been found at the edge of the woods and no one knew where she was, the initial reaction wasn't panic, it was doubt. Doubt that something this dark could truly happen here. At first, neighbors clung to simpler explanations. Some thought maybe she'd run off with friends and forgotten to tell her family, though those who knew Emma well were quick to shut that idea down. Emma wasn't that kind of person. Mrs. Carter, a retiree from a few houses down, said later. She was happy and responsible, not the kind of kid to just take off. Others speculated that her car breaking down might have led her to walk somewhere for help, but even that didn't hold up. Her keys had been found in the vehicle, along with her phone, wallet, and purse, all things she wouldn't have left behind intentionally. And more importantly, Emma wouldn't let hours pass without calling home. That's what made her family so certain. Something wasn't right. Despite these growing suspicions, denial lingered. It was easier for people to believe this was all some sort of misunderstanding, rather than accept the possibility that Emma had been abducted, or worse, harmed. Some residents even grew frustrated when police began conducting door-to-door interviews. "Why are they wasting time here?" one man reportedly asked. "She's probably somewhere else entirely." Others agreed that, while upsetting, there was likely a good explanation. "You just don't think something like that happens next door," Mrs. Carter added. "We rationalized it away because to believe otherwise was too terrifying." This hesitation to believe in the possibility of violence wasn't unique to this neighborhood. In suburban and small-town communities, denial is often a psychological defense mechanism. Researchers from the University of California have noted that people in these environments are less likely to recognize signs of crime early on, precisely because they associate their surroundings with safety and predictability. The thought that someone within their own circle could be capable of harm shatters the story they've told themselves about their world. But in cases like Emma's, this collective denial often delays critical responses. And the delay was palpable. The hours spent discussing if Emma could have just gone somewhere were hours that might have otherwise been spent expanding the search beyond the trail, or scrutinizing relationships that might have seemed harmless on the surface. Every search party her family tried to organize was met with at least a few people saying, "Are you sure we aren't overreacting?" It wasn't until the discovery of Emma's scattered belongings near her car, the bracelet charm and single earring, that the community stopped trying to talk themselves out of the reality. Someone had hurt Emma, and it had happened here. As uncomfortable as the idea was, there was no ignoring it anymore. Once that shift occurred, fear consumed the neighborhood almost instantly. It wasn't just that Emma was missing, it was the knowledge that whoever was responsible might still be nearby. Parents started walking their kids to school instead of letting them go alone. Joggers abandoned the trail altogether, opting for laps around the block in broad daylight. Anyone who didn't have an outdoor security camera seemed to buy one overnight. Every unfamiliar car parked on the street was met with suspicious glances. And yet, alongside the fear remained confusion. Numerous residents whispered the same question among themselves. If Emma's life really was as perfect as it seemed, how did this happen? For the families living there, this wasn't just a question of safety, it felt personal. It invited them to scrutinize not just Emma's life but the quiet routines of everyone who lived in these houses. If someone like her could meet this fate, was anyone truly safe? Neighbors began cycling through their memories, trying to attach any meaning to small details they may have overlooked. Rachel, the mother of two who had often seen Emma jogging past her house, mentioned she had noticed a car idling on their street in the evenings. At the time, she assumed it belonged to a delivery driver or someone visiting a nearby house. But now, she wasn't so sure. Another resident, a high school chemistry teacher who had helped chaperone Emma's last school trip, remembered seeing a man staring at her outside the cafe where she worked one afternoon. It was just a passing moment, he later recalled. Nothing I'd connect to anything at the time. Police wanted to hear about any small, strange detail. But they cautioned everyone about putting too much stock in assumptions, warning that fear could lead to drawing connections where none existed. A lot of people mean well, they want to help, but these cases require precision, the lead investigator told local reporters. Meanwhile, their search for cold, hard evidence continued. Canvassing the trail and surrounding streets, they hoped for something concrete, tire tracks, footprints, eyewitness reports, to piece it all together. As more neighbors started thinking back, a clearer picture of their initial reluctance emerged. One middle-aged couple admitted it took them almost 2 days to report seeing what seemed like dragged footprints on a secluded part of their yard that bordered the woods. "We didn't think it was important," the husband said regretfully. "We didn't want to waste anyone's time." Another man confessed he didn't notify officers when his dog started barking at unusual times near the trail's entrance just 2 nights before Emma's car was found. These details, small but specific, highlighted just how much time might have been lost in those crucial hours, while fear and denial pulled the neighborhood in opposite directions. As officers pieced together these bits of overlooked information, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted. The idea that the threat could have been this close, right under their noses, was no longer just a possibility. With mounting horror, they began realizing the danger they ignored might have been part of their daily lives. Whispers started circulating that whoever had done this could have been someone Emma knew, or even someone they all knew. Flashlight beams scanning dark corners of fences and backyards became a common sight at night. Never had so many curtains been closed after dusk. The hardest adjustment for many came from shaking the belief that their community, their safe little zone, was untouchable. Suburban security often feels absolute, but when something like this happens, the psychological illusion crumbles. Families spoke about post-crime trauma persisting for years in neighborhoods like theirs, even when a case is solved. Nobody forgets how betrayal of trust feels. "I leave my blinds up at night." "Not anymore," a father of 3 admitted when interviewed. "I wish I had trusted my gut sooner." And with time, it became clear that the tragedy didn't just hurt Emma's family. It fractured the entire neighborhood. Parents who had once let their children wander freely in the afternoons began organizing carpool groups with strict pickup schedules. Any person seen loitering near the trail or park entrance was immediately reported. It created a combination of fear and vigilance that became the new norm. But underneath this vigilance, bitterness smoldered. Many neighbors couldn't help wondering, if they had responded differently in those first few hours after Emma disappeared, would something have changed? What pulled people fully out of denial was the moment reporters began speaking on her belongings being matched to possible signs of a struggle. The bracelet charm wasn't just something she had dropped. It was clear from corresponding scratches that it had been torn off. It wasn't just a disappearance anymore. It was violent, intentional. This announcement woke something in everyone. Those who had thought they were overthinking or dismissed their instincts before were finally willing to come forward with what they knew, even if all they could share was a fleeting memory of an unfamiliar truck or a strange sound at night. And so, while the community may have been slow to act at first, they eventually made up for it in full force. The trail served as both a haunting reminder of Emma's absence and a gathering place for those determined to bring answers to her case. Police kept reporters at bay as leads began to take shape, and rumors swirled that the evidence was narrowing in on a suspect. The community, once paralyzed by disbelief, was now ready to face the hard truth about what had happened here. That truth, as the investigation began to show, was that some of the pieces they needed had been present all along, hidden among the routines and faces they thought they could trust. The clue that broke the case open wasn't something large or immediately eye-catching. It wasn't a bloody weapon, a security camera capturing an undeniable image, or a loud confession from someone backing into a corner. It was smaller than anyone expected, but its significance became undeniable with time. Investigators found it not far from Emma's abandoned car, in the brush running alongside the parking lot. At first glance, it seemed ordinary, something people might walk past without a second thought. A scrap of darkened fabric snagged on a bush, hanging loosely as though the wind had carried it there. But when an officer bagged it for evidence, it became the detail that shifted the focus completely. The fabric matched what Emma had been wearing when she left her house, the previous dye black shirt she'd told her mom was her go-to for work shifts. But it wasn't just the fabric itself that caught their attention, it was the stains. The material bore faint traces of what looked like dried blood and a set of jagged tears consistent with a struggle. Forensics would later confirm it belonged to Emma, and early tests showed the blood was hers as well. Someone had likely grabbed her or restrained her near the spot where the fabric was found. The confirmation left little doubt. What they were looking at wasn't simply a tragic disappearance. Emma had fought back, and something violent had unfolded where she stood. The forensic team scoured the area surrounding the bush for anything related. Nearby, they found small scuff marks in the dirt, consistent with the soles of sneakers dragging across the ground. It painted a vivid picture of confrontazione, sudden, chaotic moment when someone tried to overpower Emma and force her into an unknown direction. What was missing from initial observations, however, were any clear footprints belonging to another person. This absence made the scene more perplexing. Police concluded that either the soil wasn't dense enough to preserve prints, or the person responsible had been deliberate in covering their tracks. While animal trackers were brought in to interpret some of the ground disturbances, many details couldn't be fully explained right away. About 10 yards from the original spot where Emma's shirt fragment had been recovered, more unusual items started turning up. A crumpled, weathered sheet of paper stuck to a tree trunk due to the wind was discovered to be a loose notebook page. Fragments of notes were still visible, though they were smeared with what investigators thought might later match Emma's DNA. The scribbled words on parts of it seemed insignificant at first glance, random phrases like Tuesday 2 p.m. and incomplete phone numbers. At closer examination, the page looked like it had been torn hastily from a larger diary or journal Emma often carried. A strange sense weighed on the officers scanning the surface. Was this page dropped in haste by her attacker after taking possession of her belongings? Or might it have been Emma attempting to leave some hidden warning for whoever might be searching? Finding new evidence so close to probable assault heightens urgency. During early night's processing, the above these new leads suddenly heavily shifts. Narrowed hypothesis involving tight suspect possibilities. The investigation had reached a critical stage. With every new piece of evidence uncovered, the police began narrowing their focus. It was clear Emma's attacker hadn't been a random stranger. The clues surrounding her disappearance, her car locked neatly, personal belongings left behind, and signs of a struggle pointed to one unsettling conclusion. Someone close to Emma knew how to maneuver within her routine. As investigators started digging deeper into her life, a handful of names began to stand out. One of the first people questioned was Emma's manager at the cafe where she worked. He had been on duty the day she vanished and appeared cooperative when officers approached him. He confirmed Emma had arrived for her shift on time and described her as pleasant but a little distracted that day. Still, his attendance records matched her clock-in and clock-out times, and multiple co-workers corroborated his alibi for the rest of the afternoon. But as investigators looked at his background, they found something troubling. In his early 20s, he had been involved in a domestic dispute that escalated to the point of a restraining order being issued. Though no charges followed, the history immediately raised red flags. It wasn't something we could ignore, the lead detective said in an interview later. Any past behavior that suggested a disregard for boundaries became highly relevant. However, after a thorough search of his phone records and an analysis of his movements on the day Emma disappeared, he was ultimately cleared of any connection. The person who quickly became a focal point of the investigation was a man named Jake Harmon, a regular at the cafe. Emma's co-workers mentioned him almost as soon as the police started asking about customers who might have acted inappropriately toward her. Jake was in his early 30s, lived alone in a nearby townhouse, and was known for his overly friendly demeanor that sometimes crossed into uncomfortable territory. Multiple employees told officers that he had a habit of hanging around the cafe long after finishing his coffee, lingering near Emma whenever she was working. He would wait until she was done with other customers and then talk her ear off, one co-worker explained. It wasn't blatant harassment or anything, but it gave us all a weird vibe. Emma had once mentioned Jake to a friend, though not in detail. According to the friend, Emma described him as a bit much, and said he would sometimes leave notes, scribbled on napkins for her, filled with compliments about her smile or questions about what she liked to do outside of work. What stood out now, after her disappearance, was the lack of direct concern Emma had expressed. She seemed more annoyed than scared, the friend said during questioning. Yet that seemingly minor detail Jake's fixation on Emma was more than enough for the police to bring him in for an interview. Jake's first meeting with investigators revealed two crucial things. He didn't deny knowing Emma, and his explanations of their interactions were suspiciously vague. He admitted to frequenting the cafe several times a week and described Emma as nice to everyone, but said he didn't have much of a relationship with her. When asked about his whereabouts on the afternoon of her disappearance, Jake hesitated, stumbling over his words before claiming he had been at home, working on a project. Investigators couldn't find any witnesses to back that story. More troubling was his phone's geolocation data, which placed him in the vicinity of the trail where Emma's car was found during the exact time frame police believed the incident occurred. By this point, Jake had become the primary suspect, but there was another name police weren't ready to rule out: Lucas Johnson. Lucas had attended high school with Emma and was part of her wider circle of acquaintances. Though they weren't close friends, the two had interacted occasionally at school events and in shared classes. Lucas's name came up after Emma's brother, Logan, mentioned seeing him around their neighborhood a couple of times in the weeks before Emma disappeared. "I thought it was weird," Logan told police later. "He doesn't live anywhere near here." When questioned, Lucas was calm, perhaps too calm. He claimed he had been running errands near the neighborhood and brushed off questions about why he hadn't mentioned those visits before. Police noted his apparent lack of concern over Emma's disappearance, which stood in stark contrast to how much attention the case had drawn within their community. What made Lucas even more suspicious was his shifting explanation of his afternoon on the day Emma disappeared. At first, he told officers he had been shopping at a hardware store, but when investigators followed up with the store's staff, none of them remembered seeing him that day. Confronted with the lack of evidence to back his story, Lucas adjusted his timeline, saying instead that he had gone for a drive, but couldn't recall specific details about where he had gone. Police began piecing together patterns that pointed toward one clear statistic. Most perpetrators in cases of violent crime against women are people their victims already know. The U.S. Bureau of Justice reports that nearly 78% of female homicide victims are killed by someone they've had at least one personal interaction with. Whether harm comes from acquaintances, co-workers, or even family friends, these crimes often rely on that thin veil of familiarity to lower the victim's guard. Emma's case appeared to fit this troubling pattern, as both Jake and Lucas were connected to her in ways that seemed innocuous at first glance, but took on new meaning under scrutiny. The tipping point in the investigation came when forensic analysis of the shirt fragment found near Emma's car was completed. The blood on the fabric matched Emma's, as expected, but what changed everything was the discovery of partial DNA from a second person. It wasn't enough for a definitive match, but it allowed investigators to start testing key suspects. Jake immediately consented to a DNA swab when asked, appearing cooperative and almost eager to clear his name. Meanwhile, Lucas resisted, claiming it was intrusive and unnecessary since he had nothing to do with this. Even more damning, Jake's alibi came together when surveillance footage surfaced from a gas station near his home. The timestamp aligned with the critical window of Emma's disappearance, making it nearly impossible for him to have been at the scene of the crime. Lucas, on the other hand, had no corroborating evidence to support his story. Suspicion deepened when Emma's phone records revealed a series of text messages she had received in the weeks before her disappearance from an unsaved number. The messages were friendly but insistent, asking her to meet up and apologizing excessively when she didn't respond. It was soon confirmed the number belonged to Lucas. The final piece of the puzzle came after officers obtained a warrant to search Lucas's car. Hidden beneath the passenger seat, they discovered a necklacier, small silver chain, with a charm that Emma's family immediately identified as hers. The chain was broken, consistent with the signs of a struggle police had already pieced together. Confronted with this evidence, Lucas's calm demeanor began to crack. Though he continued to deny involvement, his explanations grew increasingly incoherent. For investigators, it was clear they had found their suspect, but one question still lingered. Why? What was Lucas's motive? As detectives worked to reconstruct Emma's last hours, it became evident that Lucas's behavior had escalated beyond casual acquaintance. His visits to her neighborhood, his persistent texts, and his unexplained presence near the trail suggested he had been watching her in ways neither Emma nor her family could have known. It wasn't the kind of obsession that announced itself loudly. Instead, it quietly built over time, hiding in plain sight until it reached a breaking point. Even with Lucas emerging as the primary suspect, investigators knew they still needed to nail down the sequence of events leading to Emma's final moments. The timeline was their next crucial step. Where had Lucas been before and after Emma crossed paths with him that day? And how had he planned or stumbled into committing one of the most devastating crimes the community had ever seen? As investigators turned to recreate those last few hours, the chilling truths about Emma's fate began to surface piece by piece. Investigators knew that understanding Emma's last movements was the key to solving her case. They began with what they already knew, the time she left the cafe after her shift, and the discovery of her abandoned car near the trail later that evening. From there, they painstakingly worked to fill in the gaps, piecing together her final hours through witness statements, surveillance footage, and phone records. What they uncovered painted a chilling picture, not only of what had happened, but also of how quickly everything had spiraled out of control. Emma was last confirmed to be at the cafe at 2:00 p.m., right at the end of her shift. Her co-workers recalled her leaving without any indication something was wrong. Surveillance footage from a nearby gas station captured her silver sedan pulling out of the parking lot and heading toward her neighborhood. The footage showed her alone in the car, her posture relaxed and casual, nothing out of the ordinary. Based on this alone, it looked like Emma was heading straight home. But the next time her car appeared on camera, everything had changed. At 2:18 p.m., traffic cameras caught a glimpse of her sedan turning onto a side street that eventually led to the wooded trail. It was an unusual route for Emma to take. The trail wasn't on her way home, and she rarely went there on weekdays. Investigators believed this detour might have held an explanation for why Emma's plans diverted so suddenly. Phone records, however, provided an important clue and raised even more questions. At 2:11 p.m., just minutes before she turned onto that side street, Emma had received a text message. The contents of the message were not immediately released to the public, but police later confirmed it was from someone she knew. The message had been brief, its tone casual but specific enough to suggest it had prompted a change in Emma's plans. Witness statements provided more insight. A woman walking her dog along the trail's entrance at approximately 2:30 p.m. remembered seeing Emma's car pulling into the small parking area. She described Emma as stepping out of her vehicle and looking around, as if she was waiting for someone. The witness didn't recall seeing Emma speaking to anyone or walking away from the car, but her account was enough to establish a rough timeline. By 3:00 p.m., less than 30 minutes later, the car was still parked there, but Emma was gone. A jogger who routinely ran the trail around that time later told police that the lot was empty except for the solitary vehicle. What struck him as strange was the position of the carrot was parked close to the edge of the woods, in a spot that seemed oddly isolated from the main path. The gap between Emma's arrival at the trail and her disappearance left investigators with a critical question. What had happened during those 30 minutes? To answer that, they turned to some of the evidence found near her car. The torn piece of her shirt suggested a struggle had occurred nearby, and the broken necklace, found only a few feet from the vehicle, hinted at a moment of panic or resistance. Forensic analysis of the dirt around the parking lot revealed faint signs of foot dragging, but the patterns were incomplete, making it difficult to determine whether Emma had been forced into the woods or taken elsewhere. Adding to the confusion were Emma's missing phone and wallet, both discovered inside her locked car. It was an odd detail that didn't align with typical patterns in similar cases. Most offenders in abduction scenarios either take the victim's belongings or leave them at the scene without any effort to conceal them. Emma's attacker, however, had gone to the trouble of locking the car and placing her items neatly inside. For investigators, this suggested one chilling possibility. The person responsible wanted to buy time by making it appear that Emma had walked away willingly. As detectives reconstructed her movements, they began to focus on Lucas Johnson, the primary suspect. His alibi for the time frame of Emma's disappearance remained shaky, and new evidence was beginning to connect him directly to the crime. Phone records revealed that Lucas had sent Emma the last text message she received. The message, though seemingly innocent, made it clear that he had requested to meet her at the trail, citing a vague reason that wasn't immediately suspicious. Investigators theorized that Emma, ever trusting and kind, may have agreed to meet him, not realizing the danger. Lucas's behavior became even more questionable when surveillance footage showed his grey pickup truck driving toward the trail entrance around 2:25 p.m., just minutes after Emma had arrived. The truck was seen again, leaving the area at 3:05 p.m., fitting perfectly within the 30-minute window investigators had established. Though the footage wasn't clear enough to prove Lucas was the one driving, the presence of his truck was enough to warrant further scrutiny. What sealed his connection to the scene, however, was the discovery of tire impressions near Emma's car. The prints were inconsistent with the small passenger wheels of Emma's sedan, and instead matched the tread of larger truck tires. Forensic analysts compared these impressions to photographs of Lucas's vehicle and found a strong match. Combined with his phone records and the inconsistencies in his story, the evidence created a timeline that left little doubt of his involvement. But investigators needed more. They began analyzing Emma's phone further, hoping it might provide additional clues about what she had been doing before meeting Lucas at the trail. A key moment emerged when they recovered a deleted voicemail from Lucas left on Emma's phone 2 days before her disappearance. In the message, Lucas apologized repeatedly for running into her by accident and asked if they could talk things out. To Emma, the message may have seemed like an awkward attempt at reconciling some perceived slight. To the police, it revealed a calculated effort to manipulate her into trusting him. As the evidence continued to pile up, Lucas's timeline of events began to crumble. Witnesses placed him at a gas station near the trail around 3:15 p.m., just minutes after his truck was seen leaving the area. He purchased a bottle of water and some basic supplies, items investigators would later find in his home. When confronted with this information during questioning, Lucas claimed he had stopped by the trail simply to go for a walk and denied meeting Emma there. His explanations grew weaker with each passing interview, and it was only a matter of time before investigators honed in on a critical window. The 30 minutes between Emma's arrival and Lucas's departure had become the focal point of the case. It was clear that whatever had happened during that time was planned. Lucas had deliberately lured Emma to a location where he could isolate her, far from any help or witnesses. The evidence suggested that confrontation occurred almost immediately after she arrived, leaving her with little chance to escape. For investigators, the challenge was no longer figuring out if Lucas was involved, but determining where he had taken Emma next. One final clue cemented their findings. Hidden away in Lucas's truck, investigators discovered a single strand of dark hair tangled in the seatbelt mechanism. DNA testing confirmed it belonged to Emma. This small but undeniable detail not only placed her inside his vehicle, but also confirmed she hadn't left the scene willingly. It marked the moment when investigators felt confident they had the full timeline. Lucas had arrived at the trail, coerced Emma into his truck, and driven away before anyone could intervene. With this timeline in place, the focus shifted to finding Emma herself. Every minute counted, as search crews expanded their efforts beyond the wooded trail and into surrounding areas. The question weighing on everyone's mind was no longer about how those pieces were falling into place, but about where. Where had Lucas taken Emma, and would it be too late by the time they found her? What investigators discovered next would devastate the entire community and confirm their worst fears. After nearly 3 grueling weeks of searching, the effort to find Emma came to a heartbreaking conclusion. On a chilly morning just after dawn, a team of officers scouring a remote patch of farmland about 15 miles from the wooded trail made the discovery that confirmed what everyone had feared. Tucked behind an old, rusted piece of farming equipment was a shallow burial site, the earth recently disturbed and unnaturally smooth. One of the cadaver dogs, trained to detect even the faintest odor of decomposition, led investigators directly to the spot. It was clear before they even began digging this was where Emma's journey had ended. Carefully, the team began to unearth the site. At about 2 feet below the surface, officers uncovered her body, wrapped tightly in a dark tarp. The condition of the remains, though traumatic to those present, provided critical clues. Forensic analysts noted the care with which the tarp had been folded around her, almost methodical, as if whoever had placed her there wanted to delay decomposition and, by extension, discovery. The physical evidence on her body painted a grim picture. There were visible bruises along her arms and neck, consistent with someone being restrained or forcibly held down. Still more chilling was the mark above her throat, a faint yet unmistakable ligature impression, suggesting the cause of death was strangulation. The discovery was devastating for Emma's family, whose hopes of finding her alive had gradually slipped away as the days stretched on. But for investigators, it also provided their first solid chance of understanding what had truly happened in her final moments. The shallow depth of the grave suggested haste, but also familiarity. Whoever buried Emma likely knew the area well. It wasn't the kind of place someone would stumble upon by accident. The farmland was privately owned, but the property had been vacant for some time, its fields overgrown and its equipment abandoned. As investigators surveyed the surrounding area, they noted how isolated the burial site was. No nearby houses, no passing cars, just quiet fields under an overcast sky. Forensic teams got to work immediately. Dirt samples around the grave were collected, and the tarp was carefully examined for fingerprints, fibers, or anything else that might lead directly to the person responsible. A closer inspection of Emma's body revealed more. Her fingernails were chipped, with traces of blood and dirt embedded underneath evidence that she had likely tried to fight back during her final moments. This detail, though haunting, gave investigators something tangible. DNA swabs confirmed the blood beneath her nails did not belong to her. It belonged to a man, and given the investigation's focus on Lucas, it didn't take long for his sample to become the main match. The way bodies are hidden in cases like this is often telling, and Emma's case was no exception. According to a study by the National Forensic Academy, offenders who attempt burial often act out of a combination of panic and premeditation. The grave's location indicated significant forethought. Lucas had likely scouted the site beforehand and knew it would be shielded from prying eyes. But the shallow depth and use of the tarp pointed to a rushed execution, as if time or nerves had prevented him from digging deeper or covering his tracks thoroughly. What was particularly eerie was the lack of personal items at the site. Her phone and wallet, as noted earlier, were left in her car. This omission appeared deliberate possible attempts to stage her initial disappearance as something voluntary, delaying suspicion of foul play. Back at the lab, further forensic work unraveled more of the mystery. Fibers found within the tarp's folds were a key breakthrough. They matched the upholstery in Lucas's truck, specifically the material covering his truck's back seat. This alone was damning, but it became even more incriminating when investigators examined the tire tracks photographed near Emma's grave. Their pattern was identical to the impressions found at the wooded trail parking lot. Together, these details provided an unbroken chain, connecting Lucas to both the scene of the initial abduction and the location where he ultimately left her. Soon after Emma's body was recovered, the case reached a dramatic turn. Confronted with the overwhelming physical evidence against him, Lucas began to buckle under pressure. During yet another round of questioning, his demeanor shifted. Instead of the robotic coolness he had displayed in earlier interviews, he seemed agitated, struggling to maintain his version of events. Investigators laid out every flaw in his story, the phone records showing his messages to Emma, the tire tracks linking his truck to 2 key crime scenes, the fibers from the tarp, and of course, the DNA under her nails. Each fact was undeniable, and with nowhere else to turn, Lucas finally confessed. His confession, however, was not the full truth. It was littered with half-truths and self-serving justifications. He admitted to meeting Emma at the trail, claiming the encounter had been a misunderstanding that escalated when she rejected his attempts to resolve what he described as a personal dispute. He tried to frame the deadly encounter as an accident, claiming their argument had gone too far, but refusing to explain why he had brought the tarp with him in the first place, or why he had chosen such a remote location to bury her. In an attempt to minimize his actions, Lucas denied premeditation and excuse investigators, and Emma's family found impossible to believe given the evidence. His confession may have offered some answers, but it raised just as many new questions. Lucas's admission of guilt allowed the forensic team to tie up loose ends, and his timeline of Emma's final minutes brought painful clarity to her family. Investigators now knew that Lucas had orchestrated everything carefully, luring Emma to the trail under the guise of wanting to smooth things over. When she arrived, his obsession took a violent turn. The evidence suggested he forced her into his truck after a brief struggle and drove her to the farmland, where the crime ultimately happened. The fact that Emma fought back was evident. She didn't just let this happen to her, an investigator later noted. She resisted with everything she had. In the weeks following the discovery, the community that had once been frozen by fear and denial came together to mourn. Vigils for Emma were held in the park where her family had once gathered for summer barbecues. People brought flowers, candles, and handwritten notes, many of which apologized for dismissing early concerns about her disappearance. For the Petersons, their daughter was now more than a headline. She was a reminder of how deeply one act of evil could ripple through an entire town. "We lost Emma," her mother said in a tearful statement to reporters after Lucas was arrested. "But maybe if you're listening to this and you know something's wrong in your own community, you'll act faster than we could." One silver lining, if there could be any, was the role forensic science played in providing closure. The evidence gathered from DNA to tire tracks was a testament to how modern investigative methods can unravel even the most carefully hidden truths. In cases of concealment like Emma's, where perpetrators attempt to erase their crime, it's often these small, overlooked details that prove impossible to entirely eliminate. Tactics like shallow graves and isolating dumping sites may delay discovery, but as this case demonstrated, they rarely prevent it altogether. By the time Emma's body was laid to rest, the police had pieced together nearly every detail of what happened. No one in the community would ever look at the wooded trailer, the surrounding farmland, the same way again. Detectives carefully catalogued the case as one that demonstrated not only the horrors of unchecked obsession, but also the importance of vigilance in confronting troubling behavior. Emma's case had been solved, but the scars it left both visible and invisible ensured her story would never be forgotten. The courtroom was filled to capacity on the first day of Lucas Johnson's trial. Reporters, community members, and Emma's family sat silently as the prosecution outlined what the state had been building for months. A case that painted Lucas not just as a desperate man with misplaced obsession, but as a calculated individual capable of committing a brutal, deliberate act. The charge was first-degree murder, compounded by evidence of premeditation and kidnapping. For many in the room, hearing those words spoken so bluntly was a gut punch, a stark reminder of the horror the trial would make them relive. From the outset, the tension was palpable. The prosecution wasted no time presenting its strongest evidence, beginning with the DNA found beneath Emma's fingernails, a physical link between Lucas and the violent encounter that took her life. They recounted how his phone records showed the carefully timed message sent to lure her to the trail, detailing how it perfectly aligned with the window of her disappearance. The court listened as forensic analysts described the tire tracks found both at the trail and near the shallow grave, matching them to Lucas's truck with near certainty. Piece by piece, they laid out a damning narrative. Lucas had planned this interaction from start to finish, using Emma's trust and kindness as tools to execute his crime. But the defense didn't take that narrative sitting down. Their strategy rested on dismantling the notion of premeditation. Lucas's attorney painted a wildly different picture, one that leaned into uncertainty rather than a full denial of involvement. The defense argued that while Lucas may have met Emma at the trail, their interaction was a result of miscommunication, not malice. The attorney suggested their encounter escalated due to emotional tension, describing Lucas as someone who had acted impulsively in a moment of poor judgment rather than with intent to kill. "This is not the story of a cold, calculated killer," the attorney said in her opening statement. "It's the story of a man who made a terrible, tragic mistake." This argument raised doubts in the minds of some. The defense leaned heavily on Lucas's confession and his repeated insistence that Emma's death was an accident. They emphasized his cooperation with law enforcement and his willingness to plead guilty to lesser charges if given the chance, portraying him as remorseful and overwhelmed rather than predatory. To support this, They brought in a clinical psychologist who spent hours testifying about Lucas's mental state, arguing that he suffered from past trauma that had left him emotionally volatile. According to the psychologist, his behavior stemmed from deep insecurity and poor coping mechanisms rather than any deliberate urge to harm. For Emma's family, hearing the defense try to humanize the man accused of taking their daughter from them felt unbearable. Susan Peterson, Emma's mother, took the stand to deliver her testimony. Her voice trembled as she described her daughter's kindness, her achievements, and the life she was just starting to build. She trusted too easily, Susan said, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular, as if speaking into a void. She never saw the worst in people, not until it was too late. The courtroom was silent as Susan spoke about the family's heartache, about Logan's sleepless nights and Michael's quiet grief. Toward the end of her testimony, Susan looked directly at Lucas. "I want to know why you did this," she said, her voice breaking. "I want to know what gave you the right." While Susan's testimony was heartbreaking, the prosecution also relied on expert witnesses to drive their case home. A forensic pathologist detailed Emma's injuries in clinical but devastating terms, walking the jury through photos and diagrams. The bruising on her arms and the ligature mark on her neck left no doubt that she had fought back and struggled. The expert also confirmed that Emma's death could not have been instantaneous or accidental, as the defense claimed. "Strangulation takes time," the pathologist said somberly. "This was not a momentary lapse. This required intent." Another key witness was a forensic analyst who had examined Lucas's truck. She described the fibers from the truck's upholstery that matched the tarp Emma had been wrapped in, and how the strand of hair embedded in the seatbelt mechanism placed her inside the vehicle. When asked whether these details could have been coincidental, the analyst was firm. "The probability of this much overlap without direct contact is essentially zero," she stated. Still, even with the mounting evidence against him, the defense continued to exploit gaps in the timeline. They argued that while the evidence proved Lucas's involvement, it didn't conclusively prove premeditation. They questioned why Lucas would leave behind such obvious physical evidence if his actions were planned in advance. The attorney pressed witnesses to acknowledge the lack of eyewitnesses to the abduction itself, implying that the events leading up to Emma's death might have been more nuanced than presented. Trials in cases like these often shed light on hidden details, and Emma's was no different. Witnesses revealed how Lucas's behavior in the months leading up to the crime had grown increasingly erratic. Former classmates recounted how he had a tendency to fixate on people, describing him as someone who would misinterpret politeness as interest. One former co-worker testified that Lucas had been asked to leave his job at a hardware store after making inappropriate comments to a female employee. "He never knew when to stop," the co-worker said. "It wasn't just awkward, it was unsettling." The prosecution used this pattern of behavior to reinforce their argument that Lucas had carefully orchestrated his actions. They highlighted how Lucas's obsessive tendencies had escalated, pointing to the series of text messages he sent Emma that she had ignored. These messages, they argued, weren't the actions of someone acting on impulse, they were the work of someone growing frustrated after repeated attempts to control her attention. In one of the messages recovered from Lucas's phone, he wrote, "You always listen to everyone else. Maybe it's time you listen to me." For the jury, this was a chilling reminder of how entitlement can turn dangerous. Ultimately, the trial came down to perception. On one side, the prosecution presented Lucas as a man whose calm demeanor masked a shocking capability for violence. On the other, the defense portrayed him as a broken individual who stumbled into a tragedy he never intended. Even as closing arguments were made, questions still lingered. Why did Lucas bring the tarp with him that day if this wasn't premeditated? Did Emma know the full extent of his fixation before their meeting at the trail? And most haunting of all, could anything have stopped this? The jury deliberated for 2 days before reaching a verdict. When the court reconvened, the tension in the room was electric. Emma's family held hands tightly in the front row, their faces a mixture of hope and dread. The verdict was read aloud: guilty of first-degree murder and kidnapping. The sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole. For some, the outcome brought relief. Justice had been served. Lucas would never walk free again. But for Emma's family and much of the community, the verdict didn't feel like enough. It couldn't undo what had happened, or fill the void left by her absence. As Susan later told reporters, "We got the answer to who, but we'll never get the answer to why." This trial, like many in high-profile murder cases, left scars that would take years to heal. The Petersons called for stronger awareness of obsessive and predatory behavior, warning others not to dismiss early warning signs. Their story became a rallying cry, a reminder of how important it is to listen, to act, and to protect those who might not yet see the danger around them. While the courtroom drama ended with Lucas being led away in handcuffs, questions still swirled through the community and beyond. What had triggered him to turn a fixation into violence? Was Emma's death preventable? And could it happen again, somewhere else, to someone else? These are the questions that lingered long after the case was closed and the headlines faded. But for a grieving family and a shaken neighborhood, the answers were already clear. The damage was done, and all that remained was the fragile hope of moving forward. Emma Peterson's case left a mark that the community will never forget. What was once a neighborhood defined by its peace became a place forever linked to the questions of how such a tragedy could unfold unnoticed. Her death forced residents to re-evaluate what it meant to look out for each other and how trust, when misplaced, can have devastating consequences. It's a reminder to stay vigilant, to speak up when something feels wrong, and to take signs of obsession or danger seriously. Seeking justice isn't just about trials, it's about protecting others, ensuring no one else experiences what Emma did.